close to a five-star hotel.
Right?
I got here in the United States in 2002. I came here by myself. I wanted to study. I wanted to work. And I did all of that. You know, I loved this country so much that I didn't want to go back. I lost my mother a couple of years ago, sorry. And it was very difficult because I couldn't go see her. And right now I have cousins, I have aunts and all of that, but, you know, my mom was just somebody that was always there for me, you know. It's not like the rest of the family. So I feel like alone a little bit. But I have a lot of brothers and sisters here. That's one right there.
Yeah. We adopt certain people out on the street that become like, it's like one day I was like, yeah, I am Mom, so knock it off. I'm old enough to be his mother, you know. So, yeah, you build those friendships with people because you're on a level that not a whole lot of other people can understand and recognize. But we understand because we're here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I think the homeless people, when they can, will help the homeless people.
But yes, the concept of settlement bias, which says that the form of settlement that a person has been raised in tends to be the ideal, and that alternative forms are unfit. Okay, and that is subjective because whatever society you've been raised in is going to be the forms of settlement that you've been raised in. So if you were raised in 9th century Mongolia, you might see a yurt as the ideal form of settlement, right? And so it's very subjective how you see that. But our raising in this system tends us to see that vehicle, that RV, as inherently unfit. In fact, the legal definition of homelessness by the federal definition is that vehicle is an unfit place for human habitation. 6% of the U.S. population, roughly 20 million people, live in mobile home parks and RV parks across this country, right? So the reality is that it is the bias of settlement bias which tells us otherwise, that is an unfit form of housing. The reality is that vehicle being parked in public space exposes the vehicle and its occupant to a tremendous amount of trauma, tremendous amount of criminalization, a disconnection from social services, a lack of legal representation, so many different problems, and tremendous amount of physical problems too, actual medical problems. There's a lot of challenges with living in a vehicle in public space. Edema is a big one. Also, finding a place to use the restroom in these disconnected areas. But that is all because that person doesn't have a place to park that vehicle, right? The moment that vehicle is able to park in a private space, all of that sort of goes away, right? And it is really that disconnection from that private space, the disaffiliation of the vehicle, right? The settlement bias that says that vehicle is unfit, that we don't bring it into private space. So why would you provide a parking space when you really just want to move the person into the shelter, right? But that's settlement bias, right? It's the settlement bias that tells us that you should just move that person right out of the car. It denies the value of homemaking, right? Of the value of that property, that this is a legal private piece of property, often the most important, precious materials that person has remaining from a home housed life. I think we also need to be thinking about what it means for people who live in their vehicles long term, right? And about how we have addressed that as a society for the last 100 years and more. That we have had, as I mentioned before, RV parks and mobile home parks, and that mobile homes have been a form of affordable housing, low income housing in the society for quite some time. So I think that's part of also what we need to be thinking about is how do we provide spaces for people who are living in these vehicles in a longer term sense, and how do we then the infrastructure and support so that shelter can be a normative form of housing, right? That it actually works and is supportive and healthy and helps connect that person to the larger society. Because again, those models exist. They're called RV parks. They're called mobile home parks, and they exist, right? And so I think that's a lot of it is what It's that we need to kind of break down our own stereotypes and our own biases about what we think when we see the vehicle as just homelessness or unfit housing, and take a step back and think, but what are those examples where I see them and where I know that they are normal, that this is standard forms of housing? And how do we provide the systems of support around that to make sure that the person gets the most out of it and it's safe and healthy? There's a longstanding human tradition going back thousands of years of giving alms to the poor. Often goes by the term mendicancy, the idea of the mendicant and the person who is asking for need. And that by supporting those members of society who cannot provide for themselves, who often can't provide the actual subsistence of food, that it provides, the idea is that it provides a social worth, right? It gives back in. That for some people, it has some sort of spiritual capital. They may feel good about having done this, helping this person. For some people, it's a way of knowing that you're sort of improving the lives of all members of your community. But that the idea of giving to the members of your community who may not survive, but for that support, is so prevalent among human societies that it's not that it's not a naturally human behavior necessarily, but it is a very common human behavior. And that idea has been replaced by this concept of enabling, right? This idea that if you give your resources to someone who might waste your resources, then you're doing them bad, right? That it's not that the concept of enabling is a more recent concept that really taints the way that we look at need, right? And the way that we looked at social suffering is a social experience. That I experience the suffering of the person on the street, and as long as that person stays there, from a societal perspective, it is masochistic for me to not help that person, right? And that has not something we really have in our society. I think that we can do a lot to try to bring that back.
Yeah, I didn't have any problem helping you at all last night with that. It was cool.
I think that it's important for us to keep in mind, especially with the pandemic, that any one of us could end up in our cars. One of the folks that we've served worked on the ad for 10 years in a restaurant, and now he's living in his car at U Heights, and that it could happen to any one of us. And so we need to all step up and have all hands on deck to support our communities. And Safe Lots are a really powerful, cost-effective way to do that. And we are in crisis. When we started talking about launching this program, there were double the amount of people who were unhoused had died over the last 4 years. And for us, it's horrifying to hear this, that people are literally dying on our streets of exposure from lack of health care. They're put in humiliating circumstances, and that we all need to come together to do something about it. We're serving people who have traditionally been in the middle class. We had a single mom with 2 kids who had a full-time job and is a childcare worker, and we know that they're grossly underpaid, but they can't afford to live in Seattle. We've had older adults who can't afford to live on their Social Security. One woman in particular had her MBA, but ended up in her car in this city. We've had folks, like I mentioned already, that lost their jobs because of the pandemic. And so we're seeing folks who traditionally have been able to make ends meet, all of a sudden can't make ends meet in Seattle. The face of homelessness may not be what the general public is imagining. That it's people just like you and me that are working and trying to provide for their families. And another reason that folks choose their cars over shelter is that they may be split up from their children or their families. And that's really a critical problem for us to address.
During the course of my work, one of the reasons why I stopped doing outreach work was because of so many people who I knew who died in their vehicles, living on the streets. And a safe parking program literally saves lives. I have heard that from so many people who are participants in these programs say that these have literally saved their lives. And they really mean that, not just this helped improve my life, but they very likely could have died living in the vehicle. Living in a vehicle, having to live in a vehicle in public space means that you don't have access to an electrical line, so you may not have access to an electrical heater, which may mean that you'd have to create an open fire in your vehicle. And an open fire in your vehicle can very easily kill someone. In fact, they kill many people. It's one of the leading causes of deaths among RV inhabitants is the vehicle catching on fire. Edema, right, is a huge, huge issue. Many people who are sleeping in particularly smaller vehicles have to sit upright for 20 plus hours a day, sitting in the front of that vehicle, which causes blood and water to pool in their lower extremities and can actually cause lesions, splitting of the skin, and which gets pretty badly infected and can be totally immobilizing, right? So you get a person who's already vulnerable, who may already have medical issues, who now can't even leave their vehicle, right? And I saw this so many times. And I mean, all it really takes for those who are living in vehicles, please take an hour walk a day. It really helps, right? Just, but it's those kinds of things that if you don't have a private space to park your vehicle and you're worried about it being ticketed or vandalized or stolen or impounded, going for that walk is very difficult, right? And so this is why, the provision of that private space, being able to use the restroom, being able to use, a sink, these things, because of the laws that we talked about and because of the disaffiliation for many of the people who are living in vehicles, this is a community that often has to occupy the most marginalized, disconnected, unpoliced, unprotected, under-resourced areas of our cities. There are not restrooms. These are beyond food deserts. These are places that have, if it's 3 a.m. and you're facing fear of violence, there's no one to call. And safe parking lots allow a person to place out of that. Unfortunately, because a lot of the only response to vehicle residency has been sweeps, has been a lot of the way that the city responds. And so this group of vehicles had parked in an area for quite some time, and I was asked to come and move the vehicles along, essentially do a sweep. And I tried to contact the inhabitants, and I was able to contact a couple of the people, but not the owner of this one RV. And I recognized the RV. I knew the RV. I ran a community meal in the area for several years, and the man who owned the RV was a frequent member of the meal, frequent diner. And over the next 2 months, I continued to go back to the RV and couldn't make contact with them. The tickets started stacking up in the window. I remember that being, the windshield wiper being about an inch off the actual window because there were so many tickets stuffed underneath it. And eventually got to the point where the police said, I said, look, we're going to find him. We'll figure out where Mike, we knew it was a man named Mike. We'll figure out where Mike is and we'll figure something out. But eventually they said it was time to impound the vehicle. So we got the call that they were going to be towing it, and they were towing it, and we got down there, and where I got them to drop the RV and found Mike inside, and he had actually passed away about 2 months before when I had first started doing the outreach. And so the entire time when I had gone down and was knocking on the window, he was about 3 inches from where I was knocking on that window. And that entire time for that 2 months, that was on Leary Avenue. And if you know Leary Avenue, it's a major thoroughfare. Probably 100,000 people or so drove past him on that 2 months, and didn't know that he was deceased. And when they towed his vehicle, it was rather unceremonious, and there was never any sort of obituary or anything for Mike, and it was sort of written off as just another lost person. And, I know that Mike died of natural causes, and I don't know how a safe parking program I don't know how it could have saved his life, but I do know that it could have given him a better death, and that he deserved the dignity and the respect from his community to be recognized in that. And that when people are disconnected in public space, those public deaths fall on us all, even if we don't know them.
I think it's going to get better. after the vaccination and all that. Hopefully we can get back on our feet, but right now you don't need much to live in the streets. Just a little bit. For me, I'll probably be doing this for a long time. Like I say, I want to save money for myself. Maybe go on an adventure across the country. Yeah, who knows?
A combination of listening and learning from real people who live and survive by carrying their homes in their cars, and researchers who speak from expertise in the history and infrastructure of vehicle residency, the safe parking programs have been proven on a local scale that these types of human and social services can provide forms of stability, mental clarity, and overall to the quality of life and individual experiences. Safe parking programs save lives, truly. If you are a church, organization, or institution with access to a parking lot and are willing to learn in how you can launch a safe parking program, please reach out to the University Heights Center here in the University District, Seattle. This is your sign to seek and put in efforts to create safe spaces for all neighbors and community members to grow and thrive. Tamara, Roger, Graham, Maureen, if you are listening in, we thank you for your support, energy, and sharing your experiences with us. And for the listeners, thank you for your time and support. Please consider sharing this with your social circles. With peace and take care, my name is Gemini's Gonzalez, and this is University District Story.